The well, which had long ago fallen into disuse, was almost hidden by the thick tangle of undergrowth which ran riot at that corner of the old park. The full light of the sun never reached it, and the ground surrounding it was moist and green when other parts of the park were gaping with the heat. She stooped for a stone and dropped it down. "Fancy being where that is now," she said, peering into the blackness. "Fancy going round and round like a mouse in a pail, clutching at the slimy sides, with the water filling your mouth, and looking up to the little patch of sky above." Then all at once an idea shot like a meteor through her brain. She remembered to have heard of the cursing well of St. Elian. She continued. Stone after stone was dropped, and the ritual was followed, till the 17th had disappeared in the well, when up rose a column of black fluid, boiling as if it were from below, the color of ink, and the widow pressed her hands together and drew a sigh of relief. Her prayer had been heard, and her curse had taken effect. I sprang across the stateroom and tore the curtains of the upper berth aside, thrusting in my hands to discover if there were anyone there. There was someone. I remember that the sensation as I put my hands forward was as though I were plunging them into the air of a damp cellar, and from behind the curtain came a gust of wind that smelled horribly of stagnant seawater. I laid hold of something that had the shape of a man's arm, but was smooth and wet and icy cold. But suddenly, as I pulled, the creature sprang violently forward against me, a clammy, oozy mass, as it seemed to me, heavy and wet, yet endowed with a sort of supernatural strength. I reeled across the stateroom, and in an instant the door opened, and the thing rushed out. In the remote village of St. Gervais stood the wishing well, still used by the superstitious villagers for matters of healing and of love, but it could also be put to a darker purpose. Something stirred beside her. She knew that the presence which had terrified her before was manifest again. She turned with hands of welcome, and there beside her was the shroud-wrapped figure and the wizened face. But now the shroud was white no longer, but spotted with earth mold, and the flesh was rotting from the face. I think I was a little sorry. The hands had always seemed somehow personal to me, and on the first occasion that offered I slipped away by myself to see how the grave looked without them. It was a close, lowering day, I remember, and the churchyard was very still. Directly stooping under the branches, I saw the spot. I understood that Aunt Caddy had spoken prematurely. The hands had not been removed so far, but were extended in their old place and attitude, looking as if held out to welcome me. I was glad, and I ran and knelt and put my own hands down to touch them. They were soft and cold like dead meat, and they closed caressingly about mine, as if inviting me to pull. A blinding flash leaped out of the clouds and showed me that by my bed again hung the picture of Mrs. Stone, and instantly the room went into blackness again. But in that flash I saw another thing also, namely a figure that leaned over the end of my bed, watching me. It was dressed in some close-clinging white garment, spotted and stained with mold, and the face was that of the portrait. Overhead the thunder cracked and roared, and when it ceased and the deathly stillness succeeded, I heard the rustle of movement coming nearer me, and more horrible yet, perceived an odor of corruption and decay. And then a hand was laid on the side of my neck. She turned slowly round. But gracious heaven, my lord, what a countenance did she display to me! There was no longer any question what she was, or any thought of her being a living being. Upon a face which wore the fixed features of a corpse were imprinted the traces of the vilest and most hideous passions which had animated her while she lived. The body of some atrocious criminal seemed to have been given up from the grave, and the soul restored from the penal fire, in order to form for a space a union with the ancient accomplice of its guilt. The hag made, as it seemed, a single and swift stride to the bed where I lay, advancing her diabolical countenance within half a yard of mine, with a grin which seemed to intimate the malice and the derision of an incarnate fiend. I asked him what he had heard or seen. "I didn't hear anything at all," he said. "But about 5 minutes before I woke you, I found myself looking out this window here, and there was a man sitting or kneeling on Samson's windowsill and looking in, and I thought he was beckoning." "What sort of man?" McLeod wriggled. "I don't know," he said, "but I can tell you one thing. He was beastly thin, and he looked as if he was wet all over. And," he said, looking round and whispering as if he hardly liked to hear himself, "I'm not at all sure that he was alive." Next day, Mr. Samson was gone. The Resurrection Man, to use a by-name of the period, was not to be deterred by any of the sanctities of customary piety. It was part of his trade to despise and desecrate the scrolls and trumpets of old tombs, the paths worn by the feet of worshippers and mourners, and the offerings and the inscriptions of bereaved affection. To rustic neighborhoods where love is more than commonly tenacious, and where some bonds of blood or fellowship unite the entire society of a parish, the body snatcher, far from being repelled by natural respect, was attracted by the ease and safety of the task. To bodies that had been laid in earth in joyful expectation of a far different awakening, there came that hasty, lamplit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and mattock. No insects leaped or crept over the dull earth. The very air itself was stagnant. As I drew near the skeleton tree, I noticed the glint of sunlight on a kind of white mound around its roots, and I wondered curiously. It was not until I had come close that I saw its nature. All around the roots and barkless trunk was heaped a wilderness of little bones, tiny skulls of rodents and of birds, thousands of them rising about the dead tree and streaming off for several yards in all directions, until the dreadful pile ended in isolated skulls and scattered skeletons. Here and there a larger bone appeared, the thigh of a sheep, the hooves of a horse, and to one side, grinning slowly, a human skull. Well, I felt to the right, and my fingers touched something curved that felt, yes, more or less like leather. Dampish it was, and evidently part of a heavy, full thing. It hung for an instant on the edge of the hole, then slipped forward onto my chest and put its arms round my neck. I was conscious of a most horrible smell of mold, and of a cold kind of face pressed against my own. and moving slowly over it, and of several, I don't know how many, legs or arms or tentacles or something clinging to my body. He came into the room bringing the lamp which had stood in the study. He set it on the table and waited a few minutes, pacing up and down. His face was terrible. His fair complexion showed livid, and his blue eyes seemed dark blanks of awful reflections. Then he took up the lamp and returned to the library. He set the lamp on the center table, and the shadow sprang out on the wall. Again he studied the furniture and moved it about, but deliberately, with none of his former frenzy. Nothing affected the shadow. Then he returned to the south room with the lamp and again waited. Again he returned to the study and placed the lamp on the table, and the shadow sprang out upon the wall.